Hello, I'm Asia. I'm here interviewing Mansid from the Radish Co-op. We're starting interviews in Montreal to tell co-op stories. So what's Radish? So Radish is restaurant delivery food, and they also have special weekly for grocery stores, right? But of course, he will tell us more about it. This interview is actually being co-hosted with Eleanor from the International Institute of Cooperatives at HEC Montréal.
So we started Radish primarily because I actually have a restaurant. I have a restaurant in the neighborhood of Park Extension, and we were kind of suffering from like the effects of like Uber and DoorDash and Skip over the course of the past few years. Of course, like everyone kind of knows about how the commissions are extremely high, but we actually had like a very bad like experience in regards to service from those platforms. So we often have like drivers coming in and like taking the food to the washroom or like, eating part of the food before we reach the client, right? And as a restaurant, you put so much effort into like the quality of your food and the service and everything. You want that to carry over even when it leaves the restaurant. And so...
and that's not something people know about delivery food.
Yeah.
And stories.
No, exactly, yeah, because unless you encounter one of the issues when it gets delivered, if your fries are missing, you might notice, but sometimes like the food, like, you want to ensure that it's delivered with the same care that it's made with, right? And the other thing was that like food delivery really actually existed for a really long time. Like we kind of sometimes forget that it's not Uber and DoorDash and Skip that invented food delivery. It's been around for like hundreds of years. And in our previous restaurants where we used to do our own delivery, we were able to do it at no delivery fee to the client. It had to be done in 30 minutes or it was free for the client. All the drivers were paid an hourly wage, right, plus tips. And as a restaurant, we were making money. And somehow Uber and these platforms came about, right? And all of a sudden, there's like really high delivery fees for the client. Restaurants don't make money. Drivers don't make money. The food takes longer than ever. The quality has dropped. And the whole thing kind of just didn't really make sense because, in theory, the whole point of technology is to make things more efficient. And here we brought in technology and it actually made things like tremendously less efficient, right? And so we were like, okay, well, clearly there were things in the previous model that worked well, and how about we just take those and incorporate that in the co-op model and kind of create a new venture that would have like the best of, say, the technology so that it's convenient to order on an app and all that, while still being like economically advantageous for all the different groups that are involved. And those groups eventually became our member classes, right? So the restaurants, the drivers, who are also employees of the cooperative, as well as consumers.
So the members are both restaurants as well as drivers as well, your same employees, so they're all...
So drivers, employees, drivers are employees, but there's also like the corporate employees, so think marketing, development, engineering, whatever. And then there's consumers as well. So consumers are also a third of the member class as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell me a little bit more about the new initiative you have as well with the groceries. So what you read online is that you have weekly deliveries so that more people do a set of orders, and then you deliver from even shop that cannot manage the online platforms or compete with bigger platforms. So you provide that opportunity for people also to buy local. So that's a really great thing.
Yeah. So we have a platform called Marché Radish, right? And so basically you can go on and say you want like some cheese and some fish and some bread from like a bunch of different merchants. You can get it delivered in like one basket, and that happens once a week. And it's really interesting for a handful of reasons. So the first is that the reason we actually started it is that we had, we realized a lot of deliveries that are being done today are not like economically and environmentally efficient, right? So like, let's say you're trying out, some people, they need to order a cake or a loaf of bread. It doesn't make sense to have like one person like deliver that across town, right? And so what would happen before is that people might order from 2-3 different places, and it would actually require 2-3 different trips. Or they would have to go out far somewhere else in town to like go get what they wanted. But given that like we have all these merchants who are kind of, like maybe 10 different people want bread from a bakery and 5 different people want like cheese from like a cheese shop, right? We can bundle up all those orders into like one trip, right? So the driver picks it up on say like Friday, and then we assemble the crates, and then we deliver all those items on Saturday. And that way we have like a net reduction in the amount of like trips that are happening.
So it's also less consuming, not only in time, but
Yeah.
in money and efforts,
And
even
fuel
just
and-
gasoline
and-
of
yeah.
the driver.
Exactly, yeah. And also for the restaurants from a waste perspective, right? Because if they know in advance like what they have to make, right, then they're not buying all this produce that they don't actually need, right? So they're like, oh, this week we're gonna have like 23 orders of like butter chicken, right? They make exactly 23 portions, and this is great for them because they don't have waste for all the food they have to keep, but also they can make that in a period of say like 5 hours rather than like breaking that up over the whole week, right? So it actually requires much less like effort from staff to like be able to produce all that in one shot versus like several different iterations. So it's kind of really like looking for economies of scales at a time where like restaurants and other merchants like really need it, and like other merchants, because initially we started with restaurants and like meals that they kind of prepackaged, but then we went to, like I was saying, like other types of like food vendors, so like again bakeries or grocers or whatever. Those businesses like don't actually have a platform, right? Like DoorDash and Uber is really meant for like restaurants, right? And so like all these other merchants, they're being competed against by like large kind of grocery conglomerates who have delivery platforms and like warehouses and like transportation and everything. And it's like a way for them to like be relevant in that business, in the new era where like everything is kind of like digital all the time.
At the Institute, we work currently on circular economy. This is also part of the Climate Circular Co-op. So I was wondering maybe how does Radish differentiate itself from the other big delivery service companies? And does Radish do something for circular economy?
Well, I guess that's kind of like two questions, right? I'd say like the difference with Radish versus like other platforms is that Radish, we're kind of lucky in a way that we came much later. So like, when Uber or DoorDash or Skip or whatever started, I don't want to say they necessarily started with this optic of like being large evil company trying to like ruin the world, I'm sure like the founders were like, hey, we want to make something that's like a good, like apps, like iPhone is like a thing, let's make apps, right? And then eventually like we only understood the second order effects like way down the line. But because Radish came about later, we've been able to like understand like the impacts like those platforms have on those ecosystems and like kind of re-engineer the business from the ground up, right? So like just an example.
How do you differentiate yourself from the other big companies in
the
industry?
So one example of how we kind of like thought about the problem space a bit differently is like how we perform delivery. So like we invested pretty early in like electric cargo bikes, so like the one that this camera is standing on. And the reason for that is, actually there's of course like the environmental benefits of using, delivery through cargo bikes, but the big thing that people kind of ignore is that electric cargo bikes are a lot more efficient for delivery in downtown cores as well. Right, so if you're in downtown and you're driving a car, well, you need to like stop like every few minutes because there's a lot of red lights. There's no like parking, or there's traffic and whatnot. Whereas with a cargo bike, you can literally like drive that into the building, right? You can take it up the lift if you really need to, right? Okay. And so you can do like, or you can go through the alleys and whatever, and you can do like way more deliveries per hour, which allows us to be like much more efficient as a business.
Do you do all your deliveries with the bike, or?
No, so like we're like multimodal, right? So it depends on which area you're in, right? Okay. So if you're like say in a like you're in a more rural area where like the bike infrastructure is just simply not present, like you're going to see less cargo bikes. And I think Montreal is kind of like right at the middle, right, where like there is a lot of areas that are very bike friendly, a lot of areas that are car friendly, especially in like the West Island or in the suburbs. And like I'd say Montreal or Canada in general is like not as like sophisticated as like say Europe when it comes to that infrastructure just yet, but we're clearly going towards that direction, right? So we've been investing in that from the get-go, like building custom hardware and software for the bikes to be able to do that. Okay. But that's something like Uber didn't necessarily do when they started out because like they had a totally different set of challenges, right? From kind of like the food waste and circular economy perspective, I think a big thing is like we kind of built our platform from the ground up to be like very focused on like analytics, right? So we, for example, knowing all the sales at all the different restaurants on Radish, perform like every day, we can actually estimate like which foods or which products will sell more in the coming weeks or the coming months, right? So like. So
did you? Sorry to interrupt, but did you create that software yourself? Is it Radish software?
Yeah, it's in house. It's still work in progress. Like always iterative. Like it's not like we have it and we solved all the problems already because then it'd be all over the place right now. But like. the vision is that like, let's say like we know that the temperature is going up, right? So restaurants are probably going to like sell less soup, more salads, right? And we also know like the commodities pricing of like tomatoes have like changed because of the oil situation somewhere, right? I don't know, right? Well, then we can actually tell the restaurants like, hey, like based on all the sales data, like we think you're going to sell like less products based off of tomatoes and less soups in the coming weeks, so like make more salads instead. And also it helps them with like costing of their menu as well. It's like a big issue for restaurants, like how to price their menu. So with like these factors, like restaurant owners who are typically like kind of understaffed, under-resourced, and like don't have kind of like insights into like how their business is performing, are able to like make better decisions, and that the efficiency also results in like less waste, right? Which is pretty big. Or like in theory, something we could be doing down the line is like kind of shifting resources around our membership network, right? So if you have a restaurant which bought like, I don't know, a lot of flour or a lot of like cabbage or whatever, right? And they don't need it. They don't need like 30% of it. Well, they can put up a call on our network and like have that. We can like take care of like taking that to another establishment, right? We've done more on a ad hoc basis. Like I don't want to say it's like systematic just yet, but like I think it goes to show like the potential of like what a cooperative can achieve when it comes to the circular economy and like like the economic, the ecological advantages of like partnering as a cooperative.
So restaurants are also members, as
Yes.
you said before. So
That's correct.
with the food waste that you were mentioning, how in maybe later, like in the vision, how can this partnership works together to actually how concretely are you gonna work with your members to avoid like food waste?
Yeah.
Do you have a vision for that already, or how can we?
Yeah, I mean,
work on it?
I think the main thing is always showing the restaurants the economic benefits, like starting off with that. Where like there are of course restaurants that have an interest towards like more green practices and whatnot, but like every restaurant, frankly, every business is kind of primarily motivated by like the economic incentives of things, right? And like showing them that by like adopting the analytic solution and like inventory management for food waste, or showing them that they can kind of like maybe like offload or sell their excess inventory to other restaurants, that helps them like take on those like kind of more green habits, right? Because they're realizing that like, hey, not only am I like having an impact on the environment, right, but I'm actually having an economic advantage to myself. Another thing is like there's like a big movement now for like kind of reusable containers.
Okay.
That's something like we're trying to like partner with local organizations. We still have to like kind of get the tech side of it down, but we could have a big impact there from an adoption perspective, right? Because consumers don't necessarily want to have to use a different container solution for each restaurant. If it's like integrated into the platform, right, then they don't have to think twice about like signing up and like doing all these extra steps, right? Exactly. And as we know, like unfortunately, like as much as like we all want to be greener and like more environmentally conscious, like we often notice for in consumer habits, like when something is like 10 cents more expensive, but it's a green alternative, like people will often like go make the kind of like cheaper decision, like they'll opt for the cheaper item, right?
Yeah.
So like we really have to like reduce barriers whenever we can. I think as a collective, that's like the value we bring in this discussion.
And I was wondering, so is the platform also available in between restaurants members? Like can the members to communicate, for example, I have excess. Do you want to buy it from me? Like, is it something that going to be part of that?
Exactly.
Platform?
Yeah.
Can you call it a cooperative platform?
Yeah, it's a platform cooperative is I guess the term that's kind of floated around right now. So I would say it qualifies for that, and yeah, so like consumers interact with each other and restaurants through the platform, but restaurants can also interact with other restaurants through the platform. There's like another side to it, and it kind of depends on. We're still building out all the different features, right? And like also when we say platform, there's like the technology, but there's also the fact that like as members, like restaurants, like their event or other occasions where they get a chance to like meet other restaurants, right? So we have like, some restaurants who came and gave workshops to like other restaurants on like fermentation, for example, right? So like I think like all of us kind of being part of this collective allows us to kind of like share this knowledge a lot more easily, whether it be through like the tech platform, whether it just be through informal relations as being part of the cooperative.
Okay, I've never heard of something like this before, and it shows the power of cooperating together to try to do more.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I was wondering also the software. So is it created by engineers from Radish, I guess?
Yeah.
Who owns it? Radish members?
Yeah,
then? Okay.
yeah. So the members are right, like in a cooperative, the members are the shareholders of the cooperative, right? So they directly own the platform. The IP is all within the cooperative itself.
Okay.
So there's no like other vehicle or company on the side with the IP. And yeah, so it was developed entirely, internally. So like, I have like a technology background. Like other staff on the team are developers and programmers. So like we built it in house. There are of course a lot of maybe some components are open source or licensed from elsewhere, right? As is like every technology solution today. But like it's the core IP like belongs to our to ourselves and our members.
To the cooperatives.
Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering what are the challenges to be a cooperatives and the barriers that you just climbed
Oh yeah,
to get over.
So like, yeah. There's like it's definitely not easy. Right, like I think often when we talk about it, when people ask us like what's great about Radish, like it kind of sounds utopic because it's like, oh, we do this and we do that and we do all this, right? But there's a lot of difficulties, right? And like I would say it's in the same way that like getting a proper democracy is like difficult, right? Like it's difficult to do the right thing because that requires consensus. That requires like people coming together and like we're like really, thinking differently about how we do things rather than like thinking from a short-term perspective or really thinking long-term, like building towards something. Right? A lot of people are like, why aren't you moving faster? Why aren't you like breaking things? Why aren't you like raising a lot of money? And well, the thing is like we could do all that, but that would probably like take away from like the cooperative values, right? Like we had those competitors, right? Like when we started Radish at the start of like the pandemic, there was 10 or 11 other local competitors, like not including Uber or DoorDash or whatever, not the big ones, just locally there were small 11 other ventures that existed. And today, none of them exist except for us, right? Because they all took, I don't want to say shortcuts, but they all took things that were kind of focused on the short term, right? They're like, okay, let's go raise all this money and like spend it aggressively to like get market share, right? But none of those things were actually an alternative in the long term to the existing platforms. So what everyone had was just like local but cheaper and a bit worse, which is not a compelling value offer for clients, right? For our members. I think the other difficulty with co-ops is that a lot of the territory is kind of like untrodden, right? Like in that, like, if you want to start a company, right? Like everyone knows how to start a company. Like you can go online and start it for less than $200. Every time there's like a legal dispute or something, there's been a 1,000 or 1,000,000 other companies who have had those issues, and the court system is like well equipped to like handle that. In the cooperative ecosystem, like every time you create a cooperative, it's like a brand new thing, unless it's like an agricultural co-op or something that's like kind of like very historically, prevalent. Right? Like very few people have created, tech co-ops, right? And like if you think of co-ops, there's like very few co-ops. I was talking about how there's like all the major co-ops are over 100 years old. There's been no major co-ops that have come about in like the last like 10 years that like have really taken hold, right? And I think it's just like, co-ops, one, haven't been able to like adopt to the kind of like technology curve, right? That's been like a big piece. Another thing is like financing. Like the mechanisms that exist in like private companies are a lot more interesting for investors, right? So like if you're a venture capitalist, you're not going to put your funding in a cooperative where your loss is uncapped, but your profits are capped, right? And so like for Radish, we actually have to create like a novel mechanism to be able to raise funding, to be able to do that. And so like when we started our co-op, it took us 9 months and $30,000 to be able to like incorporate. And our competitors like spent $200 in one evening and they were like ready to go, right? So I think that goes to show like kind of like what we're facing against. But that being said, like every time we do something for the first time, like it's challenging and hopefully like other co-ops open the door for us, and like hopefully we can open the door for like other co-ops that are going to kind of follow what we're doing.
It's also the challenges of being an entrepreneur.
Yeah,
it's more than also just being a co-op. It's like all the steps.
The startup, exactly.
Startup.
It's one thing to start a company in like California, right? It's another thing to start it in Canada or Quebec. Not to say the ecosystem isn't robust, but it's a very different culture, right? And like so, we're not used to in Canada and Quebec to like have like this kind of hyper growth that's very aggressive that we see in the West. But for there's downsides, but there's also a lot of upside in that like the risk is way lower, right? Like like the system here is a lot more accommodating of people like having a proper life, right? So yeah, I think like all that considered, there are challenges.
Like what in the co-op model now keeps you going and also help you strive compared to those maybe individual and private enterprises that
Absolutely,
started.
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's hard to, like, I think where the other, kind of smaller local players failed is that they tried to like replicate an existing model that Uber and DoorDash had already perfected, right? Or maybe not perfected, but iterated on, right? So you're coming 10 years too late with less money and like a worse product. Like you're not really going to be able to survive, right? So I think the cooperative model was like fundamentally different, right? And I think the big thing with the co-op model is that like your users, your consumers, and your restaurants, and even the drivers at the end of the day have an incentive to use it over another platform because they're owners of the platform, right? Because even if Uber comes and gives you a discount, like as a restaurant, you'd rather use a platform that you're a literal shareholder of. Really, Uber, no matter how much like they give you a discount or how much they say they appreciate you, they will never give you, a percentage of equity in their business, right? So despite the fact that it was kind of built over the backs of like millions of like drivers and like restaurants and like consumers, right? Like 5 people and like a bunch of venture capital firms and like the Saudi government like just took off with like all the proceeds of this business, right? And I'm not to say like it's like capitalism or like the kind of shareholder structure is wrong. It's just that like it's not incentivizing for the people who actually need the platform. And so I think that's going to allow us to prevail where these other businesses, couldn't compete, right? Like the differentiating factor, basically.
Okay. What's the main value of the cooperative value that Radish owns?
The mutualization of the technical needs of the restaurant industry, right? And I often allude to the story of Alphonse and Dorimène, who had a similar story in Quebec when it came to the financial needs of Quebecers, right? So, of course, early in the history of Quebec in the early 1900s, there was a lot of like big banks who had like these kind of usurious like habits that they were employing with like people who were local to Quebec, right? And like collectively they were able to build their own solution that worked to their own benefit rather to the benefit of someone else, right? They're mutualizing their financial needs. In the same way that Desjardins kind of mutualized the financial needs in Quebec, we want to mutualize the technical needs of the restaurant industry, right? Because a restaurant can never go and employ a data scientist or an engineer or an accountant or something full time to work in their business. Even like McDonald's and Domino's, like struggles to like compete on that regard with like a large technology conglomerate like Uber, right? So maybe individuals can, but like as an organization, we can kind of employ those people and like structure things together so that we can like offer it collectively to our members and like spread the cost and the benefits amongst everybody. So I think that's kind of like really our differentiating factor and like our biggest strength.
Very, very interesting and really innovative too. And maybe one more question is, where do you see Radish in the future? Like, what's the big vision? Where are we going to see Radish, and what's the plan with it? If you can tell us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to say, right? Because I think a lot of people, like, say, especially in startups, you have like this vision of like, hey, we're gonna like IPO in like 7 years and make like bucket loads of money, right? And like in a co-op, it's a bit different because you're always working towards like the interests of the members, right? So you really just go where the members are taking you. And if the members are like, hey, well, like, we don't want to keep growing tomorrow, like we want to stay in Montreal, like that's where we're going. Right, and if the members are like, hey, like collectively, if we partner with like other regions, right, and there's members there that might join the cooperative, right, then then it could be that like we're going to mutualize the needs further, right. So I think like that's from a corporate or like a cooperative perspective or like a member perspective. I think personal level. I think, given that, hopefully we'll be able to take a lot of market share from the competitors and offer additional products and services that are going to make the lives of, restaurateurs and drivers and consumers better, right? And what's really neat about Radish is that like our employees or consumers in our restaurants all have like equity stakes in the business that are detached from their governance rights. So in theory, if Radish were to perform very, very well down the line, we could also IPO and redistribute those proceeds. However, we would do it in a much more equitable way to all our members rather than like just a select cohort of investors, right? And so I think it's maybe a pipe dream, but it could be very interesting to see, right? Because you like, especially like restaurants or drivers, they're like typically demographics that like don't have a lot of savings, right? They put everything into their business or their work, and then like when they retire, they're often like kind of broken or tired from all the work they've done, right? So for them to have, like, say, shares in Radish that might, like, convert down the line into some type of, I'm not saying it's going to, like, pay for everything, but, like, into some type of, like, economic benefits in the long term, like, I think that would be, like, an interesting outcome that I'd like to see. But we'll see if we
We'll see. Yeah.
we'll see if we get there.
But I hope it will.
Yeah.
I would
you.
like to thank you both for this opportunity for the interviews. For those who are watching, there's going to be other interviews. You can even look at the Institute's and Radish's websites and find out more about what they do. There's a LinkedIn group you can join, and possibility to share contacts also with these amazing initiatives. And thank you very much.